So right today, obesity is beginning to rival tobacco as a cause of disability and death. Tobacco is still number one, a fabulous way of dying prematurely, in large part because it affects almost every organ system in the body. But obesity is coming up rapidly as people become bigger, and this becomes a more dominant cause of death. In fact, this generation today may be the first generation that does not live as long as their elders. And in fact, life expectancy has gone down considerably here, even in the last few years. But we keep getting bigger as a society. In fact, when I went into practice in 1986, there wasn't anybody, any state in the United States that had over 14% obesity saturation. But you can see today, everybody's exceeding that. And here in the South, home of deep fried ice cream, we've got 35% population self-reported as obesity. Now, it's important to understand that these numbers underestimate the actual obesity because these are self-reported numbers. And it turns out people consistently underestimate their weight, not overestimate their weight. And so the actual percentage of obesity is even higher than it appears here. Nonetheless, it's clearly an epidemic. It's interesting if you compare the correlation coefficients between, for example, obesity and diabetes. It's almost 1-to-1. The fatter we get, the sicker we get. It's almost like there's a connection. And the incidence of, for example, diabetes has been going up geometrically, including affecting our young children. But the dominant epidemic right now that we're suffering is metabolic syndrome. So that's where people's waist circumferences are elevated, their blood lipids are too high, or their blood sugar or blood pressure are elevated. If you have 3 or more of the factors on this list, you are, in fact, suffering from metabolic syndrome. And if you have metabolic syndrome, your risk of getting diabetes, your risk of coronary artery disease, your risk of cancer, or dying from COVID-19 or other infectious disease is dramatically higher. There's no question that metabolic syndrome is associated with these conditions. Everything from non-alcoholic fatty liver disease to coronary artery disease, myocardial infarction, congestive heart failure, diabetes, gout, colorectal cancer, liver cancer, and cirrhosis, and many others, including stroke. So what we're doing about it as a society is telling people to eat health food. And, there's major billion-dollar industry selling people, olive oil and red wine and dark chocolate and coconut anything, diet sodas, white meat, low-fat dairy, and they're just trying to encourage people to eat, the keto, paleo, high-protein, high-fat diets. And they'll recommend these high-fat, high-protein diets because they have a fasting mimicking effect. They will mimic the hunger blunting effect of fasting because you're in ketosis. There's no carbohydrate going in. And it's true that will blunt your hunger and it might be responsible for short-term weight loss, but these are not long-term health promoting diets. This is not a way to eat if your goal is to live a long and healthy life. If you just want short-term weight loss, you can have somebody cut your leg off at the hip and take 40 pounds off overnight. That doesn't make it healthy. What I suggest we do instead of selling health food is focus on healthy food. And you'll notice there's no correlation between health food and healthy food. Healthy foods are fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, a whole plant food, salt, oil, and sugar-free diet. Health food versus healthy food. So the reality is 2/3 of people are now overweight or obese. That means if you're not fat, you are abnormal. And there's a particular type of fat that's particularly harmful, and that is visceral fat. That's the fat that tends to accumulate around your belly, around the organs. It's associated with inflammatory markers, including TNF-alpha and others, that are tied to heart disease and type 2 diabetes and stroke and breast cancer and colorectal cancer and Alzheimer's disease. So getting rid of fat in general, but in particular getting rid of visceral fat, turns out to be critical if your goal is to live a long and healthy life and avoid spending years debilitated. We recently did a study where we used a DEXA scanner with some research software that does very detailed body composition. So we were able to determine what happens to people when they lose weight. And what we know that when a person loses weight, there's fat, including visceral fat, there's protein, fiber, water, and glycogen that are mobilized. And so here's an example of an individual that at baseline, compared to 15 days after medically supervised water-only fasting, and then after refeeding. And what you'll notice here is that weight goes down, obviously, when you're fasting, and that weight is composed of lean tissue, shown here in magenta, and fat. And then when people refeed, the lean tissue recovers, but the fat loss continues to go down. And so what we did in this study that'll be coming out later this year, we were able to take 30 subjects before, after fasting on follow-up, and then we did 6-week after refeeding follow-up. And what we found was that they would lose weight and regain weight, but the weight they lost was fiber, water, glycogen, protein, and fat. But the weight that they regained was lean tissue. And so by the time we were done fasting, they had actually recovered not only the lean tissue they had lost during fasting, but more. In other words, the amount of lean tissue on the body was higher at 6 weeks post-fasting than it was before they started fasting. But the fat loss not only went down during fasting, it continued through refeeding on a whole plant food diet. So this individual that went through 14 days of fasting lost a total of 12% of total body weight, 18% of their total body fat, but they lost 54% of their visceral fat. Over half of all their visceral fat was eliminated in just 2 weeks of fasting, 4% of lean tissue, and that lean tissue recovered during refeeding. And what this data shows is that the most efficient way of mobilizing visceral fat is actually water-only fasting. When people do water-only fasting in a resting state, they can preferentially eliminate their visceral fat, which is important in terms of metabolic syndrome and what we believe these risk factors are. For people interested in learning more about fasting, they can go to the TrueNorth Health Foundation's website at www.fasting.org. And all of our research and articles by us and others are located there, freely available, so you can learn more about this idea of how to mobilize visceral fat. And for people that are interested in general, they can go to our website at TrueNorthHealth.com, and all of the articles and other information are readily available there. Now, what's interesting, I just want to share this with you. If you feed, for example, rodents their normal rat chow in unlimited amounts, ad libitum feeding, they'll get to a certain size. And then satiety mechanisms kick in. But if you take those same animals and add the chemicals to their feed, the salt, oil, and sugar, they'll gain 49% of their body weight in 60 days because of the stimulation of dopamine in their brain that comes from eating these foods. And it's not just rats and mice and birds that get fat, it's humans as well. So right now, we spend most of our money in the United States treating the leading causes of death. That's heart disease, cancer, and stroke. But what we don't do is spend money on the actual causes of death. That is the reason people get heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And that's smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, and eating animal foods and highly processed refined carbohydrates. If we were focusing instead on the actual causes of death, I suggest that we could dramatically improve not the health, but reduce the costs of care in the United States. What's killing us clearly is these diseases of dietary excess and poor habits. Tobacco, as I said before, is number one. High blood pressure is not far behind it. Alcohol consumption, certainly not health food. They try to tell you drinking alcohol is some type of health promoting factor. They'll tell you it thins the blood, which is true. It does thin the blood, much like aspirin. So if you're on a greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh diet and at risk for a clotting stroke and you drink alcohol, you might be able to slightly reduce your risk of dying from a clotting stroke. But you won't reduce your risk of dying because you'll have an increased risk of dying from a hemorrhagic stroke. So, if you prefer to die from a hemorrhagic stroke rather than a clotting stroke, well, then maybe alcohol should be considered. But other than that, let it go. Cholesterol is a marker for how much animal food you eat. The more animal food you eat, the higher your risk of dying. Being overweight, not healthy, not eating fruits and vegetables, not getting exercise, illicit drugs, and unsafe sex. That's why people die. Those are the things you should put primary focus in eliminating if you want to live a long and healthy life. I just wanted to mention briefly this idea of intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is, as we mentioned, limiting your feeding window to 8 to 12 hours. That's something everybody can do, and it's a safe and simple process. There's no reason why people can't limit their feeding window. There's no absolute need to be eating all day and all night long. And if you're able to do that, you can make a substantial impact on your health. Longer term fasting should be done with the guidance of and the benefit of a history, physical exam, and proper supervision.